I looked at the bank statement on my tablet, then at my husband's smug, handsome face. The transfer was right there. $5 million sent 3 days ago from our joint inheritance account to something called the New Dawn Family Foundation. I'd already traced it. It ended in an offshore account in the Caymans, registered to a shell company whose sole beneficiary was Lydia Shaw, his ex-fiancée. I held the tablet up so he could see the final destination, my finger resting on her name. We were in our living room, all glass and cold, polished concrete, the San Francisco Bay glittering indifferently behind him. He didn't even flinch. He just smirked, that infuriating, charming twist of his lips he used in boardrooms to dismiss weaker opponents. "Elara, darling," he said, his voice smooth as expensive whiskey. "Lydia's been through a lot. She deserves a little happiness, a fresh start. And let's be honest, you have enough." He said it like he was explaining something simple to a child, like he was the benevolent distributor of a fortune he saw as his own. My heart wasn't pounding. My hands weren't shaking. That's the part he never understood. I felt a profound, glacial calm. I lowered the tablet and met his gaze. "You're right, Julian," I said, my voice utterly flat, devoid of any emotion he could recognize. He blinked, the smirk faltering for a nanosecond, expecting tears, expecting a fight. He didn't know I'd spent the last 72 hours mapping his entire deception. He didn't know that the fresh start he'd funded was actually a hostile AI startup designed to cannibalize my own life's work. And he certainly didn't know that before I'd even confronted him, I had made one call. Not to a lawyer, to my boss, because I wasn't just Elara Vance, disrespected wife and heir. I was Elara Vance, head of the Financial Security and Fraud Division at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. When the doorbell chimed, a melodic, normal sound, he glanced towards the foyer, irritated by the interruption. "Are you expecting someone?" he asked, already turning back to me, ready to continue his patronizing explanation. I didn't answer. I just watched as our smart home system, which I had reprogrammed myself 6 months ago, overrode his commands and unlocked the front door. 2 uniformed Federal Reserve security officers walked in, followed by a stern-faced woman in a suit from the office of the Inspector General. Julian's head swiveled back to me, his face a mask of confusion that quickly curdled into dawning, primal fear as the officers approached him. "Julian Thorne," the suit-clad woman said, her voice echoing in the cavernous room, "you are hereby ordered to vacate these premises immediately, pursuant to a federal asset seizure and restraining order. All digital access linked to you is now revoked. Come with us, please." He didn't move. He just stared at me, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly agape, all his charm and smugness evaporating into the sterile, controlled air. The officer touched his elbow. "Sir." That single word broke his trance. He looked from the officer to me, and in his wide, disbelieving eyes, I finally saw it, the realization that he had never been the player in this game. He had been a variable, a flaw in the system, and I was the architect who had just triggered his permanent deletion. But before I tell you how it ended, how a man who thought he owned the world ended up escorted out of his own home by federal agents, I need to know something. Have you ever looked at someone you loved, someone you shared a bed, a life, a future with, and realized in one crystal-clear, heart-stopping moment that you were nothing more than a utility to them? A resource to be managed, a function to be performed, and then, when necessary, sidelined? Drop your answer below. Because what happened next didn't just change my life. It redefined what justice could look like when patience, knowledge, and cold fury finally decided to act. My name is Elara Vance. I was 32 years old when my grandfather, Silas Vance, died. He wasn't just my grandfather. He was the creator of VNet, the decentralized data architecture that runs behind 40% of the world's global financial transactions. He was a visionary, a coder at heart, and my best friend. He saw a kindred spirit in me, a quiet, observant girl who'd rather take apart a Linux kernel than go to a prom. While other kids were socializing, he was teaching me about neural networks and cryptographic hashes. He left the bulk of his empire, valued at $75 million after taxes and liquidity, to me. Not to my charming, business-savvy mother, not to a board of trustees. To me. His one condition was that the legacy had to be managed through Vance Capital, the venture firm he'd founded, and that I had to retain a controlling interest and a leadership role. He believed in the power of the system he built, and he believed I was the only one who could truly protect its integrity. That's where Julian came in. Julian Thorne, 38, handsome in that classic, trust fund way, with a voice that could sell sand in a desert and a smile that disarmed skeptics. He'd been a rising star at Vance Capital for 5 years before grandfather died, the firm's dazzling frontman. He could schmooze investors, charm the press, and articulate a vision for a tech future that made people open their wallets. What he couldn't do was understand the tech itself. Not really. To him, VNet was a black box, a magical engine that produced wealth. My role, as he saw it after our whirlwind romance and marriage just a year after grandfather's funeral, was to be the keeper of that black box. The quiet, technical genius in the background who ensured the engine hummed while he drove the car. "Let me handle the people, my love," he'd say, kissing my forehead as I pored over line after line of blockchain audit logs. "You handle the machines, it's what you're best at." I heard the condescension, but I mistook it for affection. I thought he was protecting me from a world he knew I found abrasive. I was so wrong. Our world was San Francisco, but not the one most people know. It was the insulated, hyper-efficient world of Russian hill mansions with biometric locks, of private elevators to penthouse offices that overlooked the bay, of charity galas where a single conversation could shift millions in capital. Our home was a marvel of smart technology, a glass showcase that Julian loved for its impressing potential. He'd show off the voice-activated climate control, the AI art displays, the security system that used facial recognition. He never asked how it all worked. He just enjoyed the effect. I, on the other hand, had built a parallel, invisible network within it, a silent observer, a backdoor into my own life. I ignored the small signs because I was busy, because I was grieving, because I was in love. The first thing was the $60,000 consulting fee to a market strategy firm I'd never heard of, pulled from our joint operating account for Vance Capital in March. When I asked, Julian waved a hand. "Darling, it's for the Henderson deal. Niche expertise, don't worry your brilliant head about it." Then it was the upgrade to our private server farm in a South Bay data bunker, a $200,000 project he authorized without my signature, explaining it was for future proofing. He'd always frame my questions as a lack of business acumen. "Elora, this is how the game is played. You have to spend money to make money, trust me." And I did. I trusted the man who held me at night and told me I was his anchor. The man who, on our first anniversary, gifted me a stunning, custom-built quantum computing rig, a beautiful cage for a beautiful bird. "For your projects," he'd said, beaming. It was only later I realized its isolated architecture was perfect for running simulations he wouldn't want on the main Vance network. The shift began subtly. He started suggesting I step back from my day job at the Fed. "It's a conflict of interest, sweetheart. People are talking. They think your loyalty is divided. Why stress yourself? The inheritance is more than enough." He began holding more partner briefings at the house from which I was politely excluded. "Boring financial stuff, my love, you'd be miserable." I'd hear laughter from his study, the clink of glasses, the booming, confident voice of Carter Blythe, a hedge fund shark Julian had grown oddly close to. One evening, after one such meeting, I came downstairs for water. Julian and Blythe were in the living room, the lights low. They hadn't heard me. "Once the legacy protocols are gracefully deprecated," Julian was saying, swirling a brandy, "the new architecture is more malleable, friendlier to aggressive growth." Blythe chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "And the wife, the genius guardian of the legacy protocols." Julian's sigh was the most chilling sound I'd ever heard from him, a sound of profound, weary inconvenience. "Elora is emotionally attached to her grandfather's ghost. She sees code as scripture. Once the transition is complete and the value is secured under the new structure, she'll come around, or she'll have the comfort of her money and her machines. Either way, the foundation will be laid." I stood frozen in the shadow of the hallway, the cold from the polished floor leaching up through my bare feet. I wasn't a partner, I was a problem to be managed, a legacy to be transitioned, a ghost to be exorcised. The real betrayal, the tearing point, didn't happen in the shadows. It happened in the blazing, humiliating light of a public stage. It was the annual Vance Capital Horizon Gala, a black tie event for 200 of the most powerful people in tech and finance, held at the Museum of Modern Art. I was in a gown that cost more than my first car, feeling like an imposter. Julian was in his element, a king holding court. The evening was a showcase for him, a celebration of Vance Capital's new direction. I was seated at the head table, smiling until my face ached, listening to speaker after speaker praise Julian's visionary leadership. Not a single mention of Sila's, not a single mention of VNet's foundational integrity. Then Julian took the podium, his smile blinding under the lights. He gave a speech about innovation, about not being chained to the past, about the need for dynamic, human-centric financial ecosystems. It was all buzzwords and bullshit, and the crowd ate it up. Then he announced the launch of the New Dawn Fund, a venture philanthropy initiative. Our first major act, he boomed, is a $5 million anchor grant to support women-led tech startups in emerging economies, a true fresh start. The screen behind him lit up with a sleek logo. The room erupted in applause. I felt a cold trickle of dread. I hadn't approved any New Dawn Fund. I hadn't seen any proposal. That was my money, our money, grandfather's money. After the speech during the cocktail hour, I found him surrounded by admirers. I waited, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. When there was a brief lull, I touched his arm. Julian, the New Dawn Fund, I need to see the prospectus, the governance structure. He turned to me, his public smile still plastered on, but his eyes were ice. Not now, Alara. Yes, now, I insisted, my voice low but firm. That's a significant commitment. I'm a controlling partner. I need to be consulted. The small circle around us fell silent. Julian's smile didn't waver, but it changed. It became a weapon. He put a hand on my shoulder, a gesture that looked affectionate to the crowd but felt like a steel vice. Sweetheart, he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. This is exactly what I mean. This is why you need to focus on the technical side. This fund is about people, about heart. It's about the big picture. You get lost in the details, in the numbers on the screen. He gave a little laugh, a sound that invited the others to join in. She's a savant with firewalls, he said, addressing the group, but ask her to read a room? He shook his head, the picture of loving exasperation. A titter of laughter rippled through the listeners. My face burned. I saw Carter Blythe smirk into his champagne flute. I saw the pitying looks from the other wives. The money, Julian, I pressed, my voice trembling despite my best effort. Which account did it draw from? He sighed, as if dealing with a stubborn child. From the Joint Legacy Liquidity Pool. Where else? It's for charity, Alara, for good. Try to think beyond the ledger for once in your life. He then leaned in, his lips close to my ear, his voice a venomous whisper only I could hear. Stop embarrassing us. Go smile and look pretty. That's your job tonight. He pulled back, gave my shoulder a final, dismissive pat, and turned away, seamlessly absorbing himself back into the conversation as if I had vanished. The circle closed around him, leaving me standing alone on the periphery. The music swelled, laughter bubbled around me, but to me, it was all silent. All I could hear was the roaring in my ears. All I could feel was the heat of 1,000 eyes on my back, the crushing weight of his public dismantling of me. I wasn't his partner. I was his pet, a technically gifted pet who was misbehaving. I stood there, my heart a cold, hard stone in my chest, the tears not of sadness but of pure, undiluted rage burning behind my eyes. I didn't let them fall. I walked out of that gala alone, the sounds of my husband's triumph fading behind me. That night, he didn't come home until 3 a.m. He didn't find me weeping. He found me in my study in the dark, staring at a terminal screen, my face illuminated by a cool blue glow. For weeks, I moved through my life like a ghost in my own machine. I went to work at the Fed, where I led a team that hunted for systemic vulnerabilities in national payment systems. I came home to the beautiful, silent, smart prison Julian had built for me. We spoke in polite, functional exchanges. The warmth was gone, replaced by a frigid détente. He thought he'd won. He thought his public humiliation had put me back in my box, the box labeled technical support. He was busy, always in meetings, often with Carter Blythe, often working late at the server farm he'd upgraded. The same server farm that, according to the Vance Capital Network logs I now scrutinized with forensic detachment, was running massive, encrypted data migrations during off hours. The silence in our house wasn't empty, it was full of his scheming. My despair had solidified into something else, a patient, watchful fury. I was waiting for the system to present its full logic. I was waiting for the bug to reveal its entire code path. The discovery happened on a Tuesday. It was raining, a cold, persistent San Francisco drizzle that blurred the city lights outside my office window. I was performing a routine deep layer audit on a new, experimental financial data pipeline that a consortium of banks was testing. The protocol looked elegant, sophisticated, but there was a familiarity to its encryption layer, a specific, unnecessary complexity in its hashing algorithm that I'd seen once before. In the custom kernel of my anniversary gift, the quantum computing rig. A signature. My fingers went still on the keyboard. I isolated the algorithm, ran a comparative analysis against the proprietary code libraries of Vance Capital. It wasn't just similar, it was a fork. A mutated version of my grandfather's core VNet protocols, but with a backdoor, a clever, nearly invisible series of triggers that would allow a privileged user to divert transaction flows, to create phantom assets, to siphon value into a parallel ledger. A ledger no one was auditing. My blood went cold, then hot. This wasn't just Julian stealing money for his ex. This was bigger. This was him trying to steal the engine itself. He wasn't just draining the bank account, he was planning to swap out the foundation of the house while I was still living in it. I went deeper, my access at the Fed giving me clearance to trace network nodes that would be invisible to anyone else. The experimental pipeline wasn't just a test. It was a live, parallel network. It was being fed. I followed the data tributaries. They led back to a cluster of servers registered to a shell company in Luxembourg. That shell company's financial traffic showed regular, massive injections of capital from an entity called the New Dawn Family Foundation. The circle closed with a click that was almost audible in the silent room. The charity was a fraud. It was a capital laundromat. It took donations from our inheritance, mixed them with other shady inflows, and used them to fund the development of this parasitic, competing network. A network designed to be malleable, as Julian had said, designed for aggressive growth, designed to be controlled by him and his new partners. Lydia Shaw's name appeared again, not just as a beneficiary, but as the listed CEO of the shell company's operational arm. She wasn't just getting a payoff, she was running his side operation. The final piece fell into place when I hacked the email server of the data bunker. I found the exchange, dated 2 days after the gala. It was from Julian to Carter Blythe. The subject line, Phase 2, discredit and replace. The body was succinct. The emotional attachment to the legacy system is the primary vulnerability. Once the heir is perceived as unstable, perhaps suffering from the stress of her grandfather's loss, maybe making erratic financial decisions, the board will be forced to intervene. My control will be finalized. The Vance protocols will be deprecated. The new architecture is ready. Her signature is the only key we lack. Working on that. He was going to have me declared incompetent. To use my grief, my focus, my very identity against me, to legally seize what my grandfather had entrusted to me. I sat back in my chair. The rain streaked the window like tears on a face. I didn't cry. I took a slow, deliberate breath, the kind you take before diving into deep, dark water. That's when I knew exactly what I had to do. He saw a system to be gamed. I saw a system to be weaponized. The plan wasn't born of hot rage. It was architected, cool and precise like the code I was raised on. I needed a countermeasure that was elegant, self-executing, and utterly inescapable. I couldn't just expose him. I had to make the system itself reject him. I had to use his own tools, his own greed, to build his prison. My revenge mechanism would be a digital karma, a logic bomb, but not one of destruction. One of revelation and reclamation. It would lie dormant within the very parasitic financial network he was building, and it would trigger a cascading audit that would expose every stolen dollar, freeze every illicit asset, and automatically transfer every cent, plus a legally calculable penalty, into a trust he could never touch. And it would all happen publicly, at a moment of his maximum perceived triumph. I started by building a mirror of his shadow network on a secure, air-gapped server in a Fed research lab. I needed to understand its every permutation, its every fail-safe. I worked only at night from my office, my face bathed in the glow of the terminal. I recruited no one, but I consulted one old ally, the ghost of my grandfather. Not literally, but his life's work, his personal journals filled with notes on ethical system design. In one margin, he'd scribbled, "The only true security is a system that corrects its own abuses automatically." A self-healing protocol. That was my blueprint. I would create a self-healing protocol for my inheritance. The tools were already in my hands. My position at the Fed gave me access to the master certification authorities for bank routing numbers and the cryptographic seeds for major transaction validation chains. I wouldn't abuse it. I would use it to enforce the law. I crafted a suite of audit demons, tiny, intelligent programs, and began subtly injecting them into the data streams flowing from the New Dawn Foundation into Julian's shadow network. They were designed to look like normal network noise, to attach themselves to transaction metadata and replicate. Their sole purpose was to map, to link, to create an irrefutable chain of evidence from our drained accounts, through the charity, to Lydia's offshore holdings, and finally into the capital, fueling the rival network. The most delicate part was the trigger. It couldn't be a timer or a remote command I'd have to send. It had to be something he would do himself, a final, arrogant act that would spring the trap. I found it in the network's code. Julian, impatient and technically ignorant, had ordered his engineers to build an inheritance bridge, a protocol to automatically transfer all assets and authority from the deprecated VNet to his new network upon a single, cryptographic signature. My signature. He was literally building a system to usurp mine, so I rewrote the bridge. I buried my own code deep within its authentication sequence. Now, when he thought he was finally forcing my hand, when he thought he was compelling me to sign over my legacy, the bridge would still work, but in reverse. It wouldn't transfer power to him. It would initiate Project Gorgon, my self-healing protocol. It would lock every asset in place, unleash the audit demons to publish their maps to a public ledger, and file simultaneous reports with the SEC, the IRS, the Fed, and the California Attorney General. It would also trigger a clause in my grandfather's will that I'd had our lawyers quietly reinforce, a penalty clause for anyone attempting to divert assets via fraud, entitling the estate to treble damages. I also needed to reclaim my physical space. Our smart home was his stage. I made it my sensor grid. I used my backdoor access to subtly rewire its logic. The microphones in the rooms he used for his meetings, they began creating encrypted, off-site backups. The facial recognition logs at the front door, they started correlating visitor timestamps with anomalous financial transactions. The house itself became a silent witness, gathering evidence. The final step was the venue. I needed his downfall to be as public as his betrayal. I learned through the home system logs that Julian and Carter Blythe were planning a partners demonstration in 2 months, a private, high-stakes unveiling of the new financial network to a select group of hedge fund managers and institutional investors. It was to be held at the Vance Capital headquarters in the glass-walled executive briefing center on the 50th floor. That was perfect. That was the stage. I spent those 2 months in a state of eerie calm. I played my part. I was the distant, preoccupied wife. I let him believe the gala incident had broken me, that I was retreating into my technical shells. He'd come home, brimming with false confidence, and say things like, "You seem better, darling, more focused." And I'd just nod, my eyes on my screen. "I'm just working on a stability patch," I'd say. And I was. Everything was ready. The audit demons were in place, sleeping in the heart of his beast. The Gorgon protocol was loaded into the inheritance bridge, its stony gaze awaiting his own arrogance to wake it. The house was listening. All I had to do was wait for the perfect moment, for him to hand me the pen and demand my signature, thinking it was his victory. The system was primed. The trap was set. Now, I just had to wait for him to walk into it. The day of the partners' demonstration dawned clear and sharp, a rare San Francisco sky so blue it looked artificial. Julian was electric with a tense, glittering energy. He dressed with extra care, choosing a suit that cost more than most people's yearly salary, his smile a razor's edge of anticipation. "Today's the day, Alara," he said at breakfast, barely touching his coffee. "The day we secure the future, our future." He said our, but his eyes were already gazing past me, at the monument he was about to erect to himself. I wore a simple, severe black suit, my hair pulled back. I looked like what I was, an auditor. "I'll be there," I said, my voice neutral. He mistook my calm for submission. "Good, it's important you see this, to understand the scale of what we're building." The Vance Capital Briefing Center was a theater of glass and light, with a panoramic view that seemed to hold the entire bay. The air hummed with low, expensive murmurs and the scent of imported coffee. About 40 people were there, men and women whose names were on office towers, whose decisions moved markets. Carter Blythe held court in one corner, his laugh a sharp bark. Lydia Shaw was there, I noted with cold interest. She looked polished, confident, sipping champagne at 10 a.m. She didn't glance my way. I was furniture to her, too. Julian took the central podium, the wall behind him a massive, dormant screen. He welcomed everyone, his voice a masterpiece of persuasive warmth. He spoke of legacy, but it was a legacy he was claiming as his own invention. He spoke of innovation, of breaking free from the constraints of outdated thinking. Every pointed phrase was a tiny dagger aimed at the ghost of Silas Vance, and by extension at me. I stood at the very back of the room, near the door, a silent shadow. Then the demonstration began. The screen lit up with the sleek, predatory interface of his new network, dubbed EthaFlow. He walked them through its features, blistering transaction speeds, adaptive compliance filters, customizable asset rules. It was all presented as revolutionary. I saw it for what it was, a beautifully packaged engine for fraud. The crowd was impressed. I saw nods, thoughtful strokes of chins. Money was poised to move. And now, Julian said, his voice dropping to a confidential, momentous tone, the final step in our seamless transition, the unification of the old and the new, to ensure continuity for all our legacy partners. He turned, his eyes finding me at the back of the room. All heads swiveled to follow his gaze. I felt the weight of their curiosity, their impatience. My wife, Alara Vance, the granddaughter of our founder and the technical custodian of the original VNet protocols, will now provide the final authorization. Her cryptographic signature will migrate all existing Vance Capital assets and contracts to the secure, advanced Ether flow environment. He held out a hand, gesturing me forward. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons, a public performance of my capitulation. I walked slowly down the center aisle, the click of my heels the only sound in the hushed room. I reached the podium. A sleek, biometric signature pad was already lit up, waiting. Julian leaned in close, his smile for the audience, his words a hissed command for me alone. "Sign it, Alara. It's time to stop living in the past." I looked at the pad. I looked at his face, flushed with victory. I could see the future he imagined in that moment, me, sidelined forever, him, the undisputed king of a shiny, hollow empire. I placed my hand on the cool glass of the reader. I didn't look at him. I looked at the screen behind him. "For grandfather," I said quietly, but the room mics picked it up. I pressed my palm flat. The system word, authenticating me. A green VRIFID flash appeared. Julian's shoulders relaxed, a triumphant exhale he couldn't quite suppress. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the screen behind him flickered. The EtherFlow logo dissolved. In its place, a stark command line interface appeared, lines of code scrolling faster than the eye could follow. A title header bloomed in bright red letters, Project Gorgon initiated, Audit Cascade engaged. Julian froze. What is this?" he stammered, staring at the screen. "A glitch," he said, louder, forcing a laugh for the audience. "A minor glitch." But the code kept scrolling. Then windows began popping open, tiling across the massive display. One showed the $5 million transfer to the new Dawn Family Foundation, with my earlier trace overlay highlighting its path to the Cayman's account and a photo of Lydia Shaw flashing beside it. A collective gasp went up. Lydia's champagne flute slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor. Another window displayed the email chain between Julian and Carter Blythe. Phase 2, discredit and replace. Julian's face went bone white. "Turn it off," he shouted, spinning to the terrified tech in the booth. "Kill the feed." Network command lockout in effect. A calm, synthetic voice announced through the sound system. My voice modulated, I'd recorded it. "Initiation biometric, Julian Thorne. Security override confirmed." More windows bloomed. Bank statements. Shell company registrations with Lydia's name. The schematics of the Shadow server farm with logs showing the illicit data migrations. A real-time map showed the audit demons activating, tracing connections, painting a spiderweb of fraud in bright, accusing lines. It linked every dollar, every transaction, every conspirator in the room. Carter Blythe was on his feet, his face purple with rage. "You idiot!" he roared at Julian. The climactic moment came when a final, large window centered itself. It was a live video feed from our living room. It played a clip from 2 nights prior. Julian and Blythe were on the sofa. Julian's voice, clear as a bell, filled the silent, horrified briefing center. "Once she signs, the narrative is hers. The stress, the instability, the board will have no choice. The Vance legacy becomes mine to redefine. The old man's code is sentimental garbage. My network is the future." On the screen, Blythe nodded. "And the wife?" Julian shrugged, taking a sip of scotch. "She'll have her money and her memories. She can keep the ghost company." The recording froze. The room was utterly, profoundly silent. You could hear the hum of the HVAC. Every eye was locked on Julian, who stood paralyzed at the podium, his mouth working but no sound coming out. The arrogance was gone, utterly erased, replaced by the raw, naked terror of a man watching his entire world disintegrate in real time. He turned to me, his eyes wide, his lips trembling. "Alara, what have you done?" I met his gaze, my own face a placid mask. "I initiated the self-healing protocol, Julian. You were the vulnerability. The system is correcting itself." Just then, the main doors to the briefing center opened. The 2 Federal Reserve security officers from my home, along with the woman from the OIG and 2 others in FBI jackets, walked in. They moved with grim, purposeful authority. Julian saw them and took an involuntary step back, bumping into the podium. The woman from the OIG stepped forward, her voice crisp in the silence. Julian Thorne, Carter Blythe, Lydia Shaw. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering. You have the right to remain silent. The agents moved in. As they handcuffed Julian, his eyes never left mine. They were wide, bewildered, broken. The final, powerful image was of him, in his $10,000 suit, being led away in cuffs through a sea of his former admirers, who now looked at him with a mixture of revulsion and naked opportunism, already calculating their distance. The king was gone. Only the flaw remained. The aftermath was not swift. It was methodical, legal, and quantified with a precision that would have made my grandfather proud. The system I'd triggered worked exactly as architected. The audit demons compiled a dossier so comprehensive that the prosecution called it the roadmap to a conviction. Julian, Carter Blythe, and Lydia Shaw were charged with 17 counts each. There was no plea bargain. The evidence was unassailable, most of it self-generated by their own platforms. Julian was sentenced to 8 years in a federal correctional institution, with a mandatory minimum of 6 years and 8 months. He was also ordered to pay restitution of $12.7 million, the treble damages from the estate's penalty clause, on top of the $5 million he'd stolen, which was automatically seized and returned. The judge called his scheme a profound breach of fiduciary and personal trust, executed with cold-blooded avarice. Carter Blythe, whose hedge fund collapsed overnight when the news broke, received 5 years and a personal fine of $3.5 million for his role in market manipulation. His reputation was obliterated. The financial press dubbed him the Silicon Sycophant. Lydia Shaw, who had believed she was Julian's partner in love and crime, was sentenced to 3 years for money laundering and conspiracy. The New Dawn Family Foundation was dissolved. Its remaining assets, a little over $800,000, forfeited to the federal government. The Shadow server farm was seized as evidence and later auctioned off, the proceeds going to the court. The Vance Capital Board, who had been perilously close to endorsing Julian's new direction, fell over themselves to apologize. They unanimously voted to reinstate the original VNet protocols as the firm's sole technological backbone and offered me the position of chairwoman of the board. I accepted, on the condition that we established a new, transparent governance committee with a mandate for ethical tech oversight. The partners who had attended that fatal demonstration. Many faced SEC investigations of their own for their eagerness to invest in an unregistered, fraudulent security. Their names were quietly scrubbed from the social registers. Julian's mother, who had always seen me as an unworthy, nerdy intruder into her son's glorious future, sent a single, terse email. "I hope you're happy." I deleted it unread. My own mother, finally understanding the depth of the betrayal, wept and apologized for ever having been charmed by him. "Your grandfather knew," she said, her voice thick with regret. "He always said Julian was a shell. I should have listened." The house in Russian Hill, the scene of the crime, was sold. The smart systems were wiped clean of my backdoors and his ghosts. The proceeds, along with the full, restored inheritance, were placed into a blind trust that I control, its assets now guarded by the very same self-healing protocol principles I used to bring Julian down. The financial world for a little while spoke of nothing else. They called it the Gorgon Sting. Some painted me as a vindictive ice queen. Most, especially the women in tech who had endured their own versions of condescension and theft, understood. I received letters from strangers, thanking me for showing that the quiet girl in the corner, the one who understands the machines, might just be the most dangerous person in the room. My redemption wasn't about wealth, though the financial security was a profound relief. It was about sovereignty. The redemption was waking up in my new home, a renovated mid-century modern house in the Marin Headlands with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto wild, untamed coastline instead of a curated cityscape. There were no smart systems here that I hadn't built from the ground up, with no backdoors except my own. The air smelled of salt and eucalyptus, not sterile filtration. I left the Fed not with a scandal, but with honor. The deputy governor herself took me to lunch and said, "You did, in a private capacity, what we aspire to do every day. You made the system work for justice." I now run Vance Capital as its chairwoman and principal architect. We've launched the only venture fund that requires, as a condition of investment, a full, independent audit of a company's ethical AI and data governance frameworks. We call it the SELAS standard. It's become a mark of integrity in an industry desperate for trust. I heard about Julian, of course. You can't fully escape the echoes of a public implosion. He served 2 years of his sentence before an appeal on a technicality, argued by a desperate new lawyer, got him out on probation. The financial penalties had bankrupted him. The notoriety made him unemployable in any legitimate firm. The last verified sighting, reported by a tech gossip blog, was of him working as a greeter at a high-end car dealership in Palo Alto, his charm now a faded, desperate tool. The blog post included a blurry photo. He looked a decade older, his smile strained, his eyes hollow. He was a ghost haunting the edges of the world he tried to steal. Lydia Shaw served her full term and was deported upon release. Carter Blythe died of a heart attack in prison 6 months before his parole hearing. Karma, as they say, is a patient ledger. My personal victory is quieter. It's the deep, unshakable peace of a Sunday morning. It's sitting on my deck with a cup of black coffee, the only code in front of me being the flight patterns of hawks circling the cliffs. It's the ability to walk into a room, any room, and know that my power isn't borrowed, isn't contingent on someone else's perception. It's my own. It's the emails I get from young women in engineering, asking for career advice and being able to tell them. Specialize in something true, understand the deep layers, and never, ever let anyone convince you that your expertise is a secondary trait. Once, about a year after the trial, I was at a charity fundraiser for girls' STEM education. An older investor, a man who had known my grandfather, came up to me. He shook my hand, his grip firm, his eyes earnest. "Silas would be so proud," he said. "Not of the money, not of the company. He'd be proud that you protected the integrity of the system. He'd be proud you were the guardian he knew you were." I just nodded because if I'd spoken, my voice might have cracked. And that's when I finally understood what real peace feels like. It's not the absence of conflict. It's the quiet, absolute certainty that you are whole and your house is in order and the locks are your own. So here's what I learned from all of this, what I want you to take from my story. They thought I was weak because I was quiet. They mistook my observation for passivity, my precision for small-mindedness. They believed that because I understood machines, I didn't understand the human heart. But they were wrong. The deepest code isn't written in silicon, it's written in character. It's the algorithm of integrity that runs underneath everything. If there's one thing I want you to remember, it's this: God doesn't like ugly, and karma never forgets an address. But you don't have to wait for karma. If you have the knowledge, if you have the truth, you can help karma keep its books. I look at the comments on these stories sometimes. I see the pain, the betrayal, the quiet fury of people who have been made to feel small by someone they trusted. So I want to ask you, and I want you to be honest. Have you ever been betrayed by someone who saw your kindness as a weakness? Have you ever had your passion, your expertise, your very soul treated as a convenient tool by someone who was supposed to be your partner? Drop your answer below. Tell me your story, because you're not alone in that feeling. And sometimes, just knowing that can be the first step toward taking your power back. If this story of standing up for what's right, of using quiet strength to confront loud arrogance, resonated with you, then hit that subscribe button. You're not just subscribing to a channel, you're joining a community that believes in justice, in integrity, and in the power of a well-timed, well-planned comeback. Stories like this, stories of everyday people finding extraordinary strength, are waiting for you every week. We have a lot more to talk about. And remember, no matter how deep they bury the truth, no matter how clever they think their scheme is, there is always someone who understands the system better. It might just be the quiet person in the corner. It might just be you. Stay strong, protect your code, and I'll see you in the next one.